and welcome to Mastering Dungeons. I'm your host, Teos Abadia, and today I am joined by Shawn, as I always am. As you can see, uh, that there is no indication at all that he could be, say, on vacation. No, he's here. Yeah, so that's great. And yeah, thanks, Shawn, for joining us. Feel free to chime in at any time, my good friend. You don't have to say anything you don't want to if the issues don't catch your attention. But I think that because you've been a little quiet today, I'm going to say, Shawn, that maybe we'll leave our listener corner tweetbag, tootbag, Patreon missive for next time, and we'll touch on those next time. We've got some good questions, and I'm just going to go through the news pretty quickly because we have a very very exciting guest. And the other thing is, I hope you don't mind, but for the news segment, I did invite a few other people or in case you're not making any comments, enough comments, then I'll bring in those other guests. So, and folks who are on the podcast, there may be an image of a flump where Shawn is, because Shawn is away on vacation. That's the bit. So let's start with the big news that certainly made alphastream.org get like 1 billion hits. The D&D Creator Summit. I, Teos, have been blogging about the summit. 2 parts you can find on my blog. One, I just took an overall snapshot of what the summit tried to cover. And then a second piece that looks specifically at how the agenda landed, at times not very well, with the attendees, and how we worked with Wizards to change that, how Wizards pivoted and did a really good job of listening to what the attendees, both in person and virtual, were trying to wanted out of the event, and kind of how to make that happen. So you can see the full breakdown there, but I'm going to just go over it at a broad level for those who maybe don't love blogs or looking for it to be covered here. So the Creator Summit took place on April 3rd with about 30 in-person attendees and about 100 virtual attendees. There were a lot of Wizards of the Coast staff present, and this was a really, really significant effort by Wizards of the Coast. Kind of impressive when you really think about it. Flying 30 people into their offices, putting them in hotel rooms, devoting tons and tons of staff to be present, both to answer questions and jot down things that were being asked of them, to have follow-ups for later. Senior staff, the CEO was there, all very impressive. And it didn't feel shallow or hollow. It felt like this was an investment they were making in the community, both to make right after what happened with the OGL fiasco, to try to begin that process of making right, I think they'd say. And also to create a dialogue with all the people that were there. And there were a lot of questions I had going in. You can read my blog post about what I thought before we ever got started. But then, yeah, the actual event that took place was surprising with really how well they approached it, given so many things. And I'm coming at this from my professional background, where I'm often at these kinds of events, and they can be pretty hollow. And I often have had to run these events, and running them well it's a very difficult task to do. So I thought that Wizards really approached it in a good way. So what took place? The president and CEO, Cynthia Williams, opened the event and made it clear in her opening remarks that they were here to listen to us. That was somewhat true, as we came to see. I mean, it was true. But what really ended up happening was there was a difference between the agenda that Wizards of the Coast wanted to present and the agenda, or let's say the items and goals, items for discussion and the goals that a lot of attendees had. And so that, you'll see how that came out. But one of the things we did was we got to see the virtual tabletop. Now, this had been showcased the week prior on the D&D Direct videos, so you can go to YouTube, the D&D channel, find that demo. But we got to actually do it hands-on for those of us in person. Cale Stutzman, who is the VTT game director and apparently a Mastering Dungeons listener. Hello, Cale. Cale Stutzman ran it. Was really nice to talk to. He did a great job of walking through the game that the platform that they're putting together, I should say. It is really beautiful, though it's clearly in the alpha stage. This is a gorgeous VTT. If you saw the D&D Direct footage, you can swirl your cam around and move around because it's using the Unreal Engine, and it looks like a really cool video game in the sense of the trees, the architecture, the running water in the brook that's by the tavern. That was really awesome. Um, it is still in the stage where it's pre-alpha, right? So it's got crashes that happen. They had several team members on hand to walk us through jumping back in if that happened. So they clearly expected it. They were writing down things in notebooks for any questions we asked, any issues that happened. And the approach to the virtual tabletop is with very little automation. What I mean by that is that in general, the philosophy, as Kale described it, is light on how the rules are enforced, but giving you everything you need to play the game. And this may be an experience that you favor. So, if, for example, you've used Roll20, there are a lot of things you can do. It isn't your turn, and you can move your token around. The same is true here. You can move your mini when it's not your turn. There are also things you can do. For example, if you start moving your token, your mini, you see, oh, this is the edge of where 30 feet would be, but you can move outside the room. Nothing's stopping you from moving 180 feet instead of 30. Similarly, it doesn't even have to be my turn, and I can attack or move. And that's fine in that the philosophy, right, which is to say there are many cases in D&D, and Kale said something along the lines of this. There are many cases in D&D where you can attack when it's not your turn, right? Like an opportunity attack, or someone grants you an attack. There may be something that grants you a movement, right? A monster may force you to move, that kind of thing. So all of those, none of those things are locked down, right? You have the ability to attack, move, use all your features at any point, and you have to be, somewhat disciplined to not do that. I immediately thought of middle school games I've run where it's hard enough to get them not to move the actual things on the paper, or, I could just see a bunch of middle school kids who are just tearing away at a monster when it's not their turn. So, you'd have to talk through with them, or maybe in the future there'll be some sort of way to lock things down a bit. But it's really open, and that is the approach that they're taking to it. We played on this really cool looking 3D map that you can see in the D&D Direct video. Really nice looking, and Ankheg burst from the floor, and there were fires to put out with little sort of round fire minis that were down there. That was all really cool. And they also showed that you can bring in a 2D map, and I forget what map they pulled. That they pulled one of the kind of classic maps, and they just put it on it. So you had the 3D terrain, and right next to it, this like flat map that was just 2D, and you could put your 3D tokens on it. They said that they're not sure in the future whether they're going to allow DMs to build or add their own 3D assets. They said that can really hurt performance. But what they want to do is that the assets that D&D gives you, you will be able to build with them like Lego. So I think Kale at one point said, our goal is that if you describe a room, but it's right there, but you describe it, and someone says, is there a window here? You can go, sure, and add a window there. That's a great goal. I hope that happens. Right now, these are sort of like, giant plunk down the building kind of things rather than this sort of Lego approach. But it's a cool idea. And they're focused on, in step 1, 2023, support all core mechanics, intuitive player user interface, play and assets are intuitive, DM game controls, increase the player testing and feedback. Step 2 is 2024, character and miniature creation and customization, encounter and world building, a remixable content library, and wider playtesting. And then in 2025, right? So we're talking about the year after the anniversary. That's where they start really sharing. They're increasing the sharing of what you can do. You can use the same creation tools, but you can now share creations with each other. Community feedback loop, and eventually release. Right. So hopefully release is happening there. They're going to initially roll it out to staff, then closed groups, which may include some summit attendees, it sounded like, and then to some D&D Beyond users. And it's not clear how they're going to choose D&D Beyond users, but apparently that's going to happen. They have no cost models in place. So, for example, they don't know if your purchase that you've already made on D&D Beyond means, hey, you've unlocked that on the VTT, or is it a slight change or a completely new buy? Do you get all the minis for the things that you buy, or do you have new minis, or none of that's known, right? Is there a monthly fee that's different from the D&D Beyond fee? None of that is in place yet. They are thinking about it clearly. They're talking about it, but it's not a thing that they've nailed down yet. Okay, so that was the VTT, and there was a whole presentation about it, as well as the hands-on demo. We also met with the D&D Beyond team to hear about what is coming and provide feedback on what attendees think that D&D Beyond should do next. And I like this kind of format, right? So it was like, and this is true of the VTT session as well. They would tell us things, and that part is very PR, right? Very let me sell you on what I'm doing, which, hey, that's how these things work. No surprise there. But then they would say, and what do you think? And what would you like to see? And that part was great, right? There really was a lot of questions coming from the team prompting us, and we would bring up all kinds of issues. So, and all kinds of topics. So with the D&D Beyond team, they introduced Marjorie Lehman, who is the new VP of D&D Beyond. She has been in the role about 1 month. So she's just getting up to speed. But she had there with her several excellent D&D Beyond staff that range in their level of time with the company. And they were there answering questions, following up. Like, I had someone come up at lunch and at dinner and follow up on questions. Hey, great to see you. And taking down notes. And that was all super wonderful. You got a really nice feel of the staff wanting to get, your feedback, which was awesome. The big news that they had was that they plan on having a marketplace for D&D Beyond and to allow sales of third-party material. There's not a lot of clarity about how it's going to work. Like, for example, how does it work comparing to the DMs Guild? Because the DMs Guild is OBS in a particular agreement, and things are locked in there. So can I take a DMs Guild product and sell it on D&D Beyond? I'm guessing not, but I don't know. Maybe they can work something out. Can this marketplace hurt the team somewhat? Because I thought of, back when they used to do Unearthed Arcana articles, that workload was so high that the team had trouble keeping up. So if there's sort of the support for third-party material, how much does it require the team to be monitoring and adjusting this? And I don't know. But the priority should be on making a great official product and then the third-party material. But it does create some neat opportunities, and maybe contributes to some fears that this is an idea about making that sort of walled garden. But of course, we all get to choose that. That's a thing we all have a hand in. They did confirm that the D&D Wizards site, the dnd.wizards.com, will be removed. Everybody goes to D&D Beyond, and that's where they're starting to put things. So one of the issues we brought up was, hey, please make sure that content is not lost. That errata documents, the studio blogs, all these articles that have real value, both historical and informational, that those are copied over. So we've raised that issue. They talked about how they wanted to release many more special supplements to attract fans. So if you think about the free Vecna adventure, or right now they've got a whole bunch of free movie things you can download. I requested print support for those. So we saw the Spelljammer Monsters Compendium had a great PDF, really nicely formatted, so I could print it out or just view it on a tablet. It was really nice. The later versions have been only on D&D Beyond, which isn't so nice a format to read or to have at the table or to print out. So they made a note of that. I don't know if that's something they will do. And we had a number, as I discussed my blog, around this time was when we had the afternoon session, and we ended up with an impromptu sort of Q&A. There was actually a virtual tabletop discussion, and it kept on coming up with questions of, what are you going to do about dated content that is problematic? Would that ever be moved into D&D Beyond? And how are people paid and compensated on the teams? Are you taking care of your freelancers? A lot of really wide-ranging questions. And that was sort of like kind of trains colliding between the agenda that Wizards had expected to address and questions that really were fired up in why attendees had come and hoping to discuss these things and be a part of change they want to see at Wizards. And I found myself really fascinated by it. I mean, I also had that, right? I had issues I want to talk about, like localization and translations and things like that. For example, the D&D Beyond team said that they are struggling with localizing things into other languages. And I thought, well, start with the free rules, and so we ended up having a side discussion about maybe starting with the free rules, because it's already something you don't expect a price tag. So you're not dealing with the inequity in pricing between countries. And you have a very core base that you could translate into several languages and see how to build that appeal, build a market that then might want to purchase things, localize further based on those experiences. So we had those kinds of great discussions, but there were things that you had to sort of try to get from the side instead of being front and center. Here are things we know you want to talk about. So it really was a big deal at the summit that attendees stood up and kind of said, we want more time to ask this variety of questions that we have around these burning issues that matter to us. And I thought that was really good. And it was indicative of the strength of D&D Wizards having invited so many different voices to this event, right? So I was overall really impressed with the creators that were there, my fellow attendees, and just everything they did to really bring those issues forward. Look, it's another of our guests. It's still Shawn Merwin, but he looks completely different right now. That's great. He looks like a froghemoth for those who are listening to the podcast. Um, so the next thing that came up was the 2024 rules, and I'll wrap up this Creator Summit. Again, you can read more on the blog, but the 2024 rules section was done by Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins. They said they want to have more in-person conversations. They want to be at Gen Con and other locations to both talk, kind of share their feelings about rules and hear feedback, but also things like sessions with content creators at conventions, where they would have an open conversation around those who create their own content and how they integrate them with the 2024 rules. It's interesting. I don't entirely know what that would feel like, but I like the fact that these are the kinds of questions they're asking and are now realizing that they need to connect with the audience that way. They then reviewed various design goals, and there was a lot here, but the really big things were the first and kind of biggest. This edition, 1D&D, they're no longer going to use that name, and that name was always said to be a placeholder, but now 1D&D is gone, and they're just going to call it 5e. And this represents clearly a change, right? So when Kyle Brink was interviewed, he said, well, it's 5.5. And today the team was saying, it's not 5.5, it's 5e. And the idea here is that 2024 and 2014 are fully compatible in that you can bring any monster or a class or a subclass, one character, another character, an adventure, a new adventure, and it works fine. That's their concept, right? Now, there are always going to be rough spots, right? I mean, I know the reality of that. You know the reality of it. But I like that they have thought this through, right? It seemed to me back just even a month ago, I wasn't sure that they'd fully thought this through. Or had they thought it through and they were just going to steamroll ahead with saying things a certain way. And indicative of that was Jeremy saying that when he was doing work as I think a freelancer, he had to convert a bunch of monsters from 3rd edition to 3.5. And he said, that was another edition. I had to do all this work because the monsters needed to be changed to work. And he says 2024 5e will not require that. Any numbers, such as the CR of a monster, the level of a spell, those things are not going to change. So that you can keep integrating and talking. The rules might change, but you could cast Barkskin because it's on your spell list. You can still do that. It might have a different effect. And you could use either version, right, if you really wanted to, because it should be ostensibly as powerful. They did say that Xanathars and Tashas have elements that are being brought into the 2024 version. You can see that already in some of the 1D&D playtest items. So those books will work, but they're going to be converted and reprinted so that they kind of work in that new light. So we know we're at least getting 2 books that are getting converted. The player's handbook is 32 to 64 pages longer. Some of that is more art. The art for the book is all new. Wow. They shared new weapon mastery rules. These were kind of cool. They feel a little bit like 2nd edition, where you could have kind of cool things you do with a weapon. And not everybody can do this. So certain classes have a mastery capability, and you can gain a mastery from a weapon. So then the weapon you choose in the kind of baseline table that is in the player's handbook, that weapon has a listed mastery, like slow, right, which slows your damage, or nick, which does damage on a miss, topple, push, cleave, many others. And if a class can have a weapon mastery and you choose that particular weapon, you can choose to have that weapon mastery, and now your weapon does whatever it is. So that keeps you kind of having something exciting that you can do with weapon. And then fighters can not only learn many weapon masteries, but also can do things like take the weapon mastery from one weapon they know and apply it to another, or maybe even have more than one. I forget. There were a lot of things, but it was exciting. It sounded really exciting to be a fighter. I thought that was kind of really neat. They're also reworking the sorcery and warlock, so both the fiction and sort of mechanic of it works better when you are starting at level 1 and you have your baseline of what it means to be those classes, and then you're unlocking your subclass when you hit that 3rd level. Again, it's not that I think this is perfect, but I'm really glad that they are thinking through these things, right? That's what you have to do if you move that subclass from, I'd say even the cleric as well, but especially the sorcerer and warlock, where you have a pact, you have, an origin. That has to somehow make a proper story, so we'll see that. We had very little time to look at the monster manual and Dungeon Master's Guide. Poor Chris Perkins kind of sat there for the entire time and got to say a few words. But the monster manual is going to have the CR10 and higher monsters hit way harder, and then revised encounter building rules. And then there will be new monsters. It'll be the largest monster manual that D&D has ever seen. Almost all new art. There are more generic NPCs. So if you think of those cool NPCs at the back of the book, they said, everybody's using those all the time. We're going to now have things that span more CRs and even groups such as cultists that give you a bunch of different cultists at different CRs. Then also new APEC monsters that show you what a certain type is like when it's at the very high CR levels. So an elemental, what's it mean when it's an apex elemental? Yeah, that was a lot. Then the DMG will have samples to show a style of adventure writing for home games. Same with campaigns. They'll give us example campaigns to inspire us. I immediately thought of Mike Shea's work and thought, oh yeah, I really like how he does that. So I hope they do a good job of it. They want to address 3 issues of the DMG. A lot of people don't know what's in today's DMG, can't find things in it, and don't use it. So they want to make it a better reference guide, more useful, and handle common issues. Things like there's a player that left your campaign, or you run out of ideas. How do you look at those kinds of things? There were also a lot of signed conversations, as I said, a lot of really good items, and I'll try to capture those in my blog, but there's only so much I think you want to hear me say about it in this format. But if you have questions, hit us up and we will do it as part of our Tootbag, Tweetbag, etc. I'm very thankful to Wizards for inviting me. I know they could have invited a lot of people in my stead. I tried to make the most of my time for both them and the community. It was not a perfect event, but it was a really good event. It was very clear that the team had worked really, really hard on this. They dedicated an extraordinary amount of resources to make it useful. And I think this was a really good first step for D&D reaching out to that community and trying to create a conversation. It won't be the conversation that everybody wants or wanted, but it's a really good step in the right direction. So I was appreciative of it. Let's see. I think there's a new guest coming in. Oh, look, it's a different Shawn Merwin. Hey, Shawn. Hope your vacation's going great. That is a cool tool. Some news from our eagle-eyed friend Dave at DARJR, who says that the Player's Handbook has cracked the top 100 in all Amazon books again. The Player's Handbook is at number 88, or at least it was when he was sharing a tweet about it. And likely this comes from the movie, causing a surge in sales. That's really impressive. Dave, who reported this story, said he ran the Learn to Play scenario this last weekend, which we talked about. It continues on this next weekend, I believe. Yes. And he said a lot of his local store sold a lot of copies of Player Handbooks at the event. So that may also be helping to some extent, but clearly this movie is doing a good job. The Player's Handbook has been in the top 300 for many years, surging at times, and this is the latest surge. Speaking of the movie, there are several free movie-related items on D&D Beyond that you can get if you like that. And we have a link in the show notes, or you can just go to D&D Beyond, and it should be one of the recent blog stories. And Netflix is saying they're going to create a new Stranger Things animated series. Deadline reports that an untitled animated series has been greenlit at Netflix. I couldn't kind of believe this, but it's been 7 years since 2016 when the series started. And has likely been boosting D&D's popularity ever since. So the idea that an animated series is coming out is good news for D&D, good news for RPGs. The Duffer Brothers will be executive producers. Eric Robles is producing the animated series. There's also been talk of a stage play and a live action spinoff. So, all of that will probably benefit gaming in general. And 2 last pieces of news. Kobold Press has named their game and set a date. They've been working on Project Black Flag, And Project Black Flag is the code name that they chose, and this project was announced when the OGL fiasco was really starting off, as a truly open source RPG version of D&D is sort of how they began communicating it, and they've been refining that message, especially now that the OGL situation has been resolved with the SRD being in the Creative Commons. We don't have the same worries we once did, and the OGL is there as well. But this new game is now called Tales of the Valiant, and they're going to launch a Kickstarter in May and will ship it in 2024. The game will have two books, a player's guide and the Monster Vault. A third book, they said, is possible. It's interesting that basically they're putting in all of the how to run it rules into the player's guide. The player's guide, they say, includes 13 base classes, lineages, and heritages from classic fantasy role playing, and the rules you need to play or GM all between two covers. And linked to that is Paizo releasing their Orc draft license. The Orc or Open RPG Creative License wasn't originally Paizo. It was conceived of by many individuals at the beginning, but Paizo quickly started providing resources and sort of directing the effort. And they now are the main thrust that seems to be powering this. So the what Orc intends to do is provide an alternate license that you can use for any RPG. Um, the license information is out there. This is a draft, so you can take a look at it and see what you think. But because the OGL has not ended and the D&D SRD is in Creative Commons with more to be added, it's unclear exactly what the Orc offers. It probably really differs by company or individual. And we'll have to see how well it succeeds at what it's aiming to do. One thing it does is it registers the license is registered with the Library of Congress instead of being owned by any one company. So not only is it sort of existing in perpetuity, but independent of any organization. Um, and in principle, it's a license that you could use for non D&D games. Um, and it could be something that Paizo, of course, would use for their D&D derivative game to protect themselves from lawsuits of exactly how much of the material comes from D&D elements that are in the SRD or not in the SRD. But I think that's an interesting question as to whether it does shield you somewhat, and what happens if you take someone's content that wasn't properly put into Orc. Yeah, there's some questions there I'm curious about. One very interesting change that I saw is from my understanding, the license does not have a product, but does have a product identity section. So you can say, these things are mine, these names, these words, this part of it. But it doesn't include mechanics. So all mechanics by design are open. And that kind of feeds into this concept of like, well, you can't copyright mechanics. And while we all might say that a fair amount in the hobby, it's not really clear that that's true. That's something that was true legally quite some time ago, and it really would have to go to court to find out whether that's true or not. So here, the Orc license is really cementing that for this license, the mechanics cannot be copyrighted, owned, etc. But I don't know how often that's true that a designer or even a company want all of their mechanics to be absolutely used by other folks. Your initiative system, your combat system, your any of it. There are obviously a lot of people who are happy with that and have put all their mechanics in Creative Commons. But is having that sort of hard rule desirable? I don't know. So we'll have to see. Let us know what you think.